I have kept the card in my desk for 11 years. It is a stiff gray intake card, the kind the Kastrell and Field Army printed by the 10,000, with a candidate's name across the top and a box at the bottom for the directing staff's first impression. Most of us wrote nothing in that box. It was considered bad form to judge a man before the mountain judged him. But I was young, and I was clever, and I thought the box existed so that clever young men could be witty in it. In my own handwriting, in ink that has gone brown at the edges, the card reads, Candidate 41 Ash, Corwin. Foreign Guest ELDRMOOR, Household Guard. DS First Note, Ornament, Recommend Refuse. I take it out perhaps twice a year, usually when I hear an officer laugh at a man because of the coat he wears. I am Dane Farrow. At the time of the events I am setting down, I was a captain of the Kastrell and Field Army, seconded to the training station at Velhold as directing staff on Gate 4. I was 31. I had failed the reckoning once myself at 24 and passed it at 26, and I had built my whole opinion of the world out of the gap between those 2 years. Men who had passed were men. Men who had not were furniture. And on the 11th of the cold month, in a rain that came sideways off the Skarn Uplands, a man got out of a household car at the bottom of our hill wearing a greatcoat with a crown on the buttons, and I looked at him through the guardroom window and decided, in about 4 seconds, that he was furniture. He was not enormous, that was the first thing. Our candidates arrived built like doors, quarry boys, ferry men, the sons of the ore towns, all shoulder and neck. He was a shade over 6 foot and built the way a rope is built, and he stood at the foot of the hill in the driving rain with his kit bag at his heel and his heels together and his chin level, and he did not shift his weight, and he did not look up at the buildings, and he did not do the thing every arriving candidate does, which is stare at the ridgeline and try to guess what is going to be done to him up there. He simply stood. The rain ran off his cap peak in a line, and he let it. "Look at it," said Sergeant Major Hesk Voren, at my shoulder. Voren had been at Velhold for 19 years. He had a face like the north side of a wall and a voice that could take paint off iron. "Look at the state of it, Captain. They've sent us a candlestick." "They've sent us a guest," I said. "They've sent us a joke," Voren said, "and I did not ask for one." That is as fair a picture of Velhold's mood as I can give you. To understand it, you need to know 2 things. The first is what the reckoning was. Every army has a hard course. Ours was the reckoning, and we did not say that it was the hardest in the world because we did not have to. We let other people say it, and then we said nothing, which is a very effective way of agreeing. It ran 100 hours across the Skarn Uplands 9 gates, in whether that could not be described as weather so much as opinion. It fed on men. 160 candidates would be presented at the start line, and, in a good year, 11 or 12 would come off the anvil at the end of it, and those 11 or 12 would carry the gray cord of the gray pikes for the rest of their lives and would never again have to explain themselves to anybody. In a bad year, none passed. There had been 4 such years. They were spoken of the way farmers speak of droughts. The second thing you need to know is what we thought a royal guard was. We had all seen the pictures. Every officer in the Kastrell and Field Army had at some point been shown a photograph of the Household Guard of Eldermore outside their palace at Harrowgate, red wool tunic, tall black bearskin, white gloves, metal ribbons, the rifle held like a jeweler's instrument, the whole thing polished to the point of parody. And every officer had said or laughed at the same joke. Very fine indeed. What are they for? We were soldiers. He was, we all knew, a doorman with a hat. So the man came up the hill through the rain with his bag on one shoulder, and Voren went out to meet him, and I went out behind Voren because I did not want to miss it. "Name," said Voren. "Ash, Sergeant Major. Corwin Ash." "Rank?" "Sergeant, 2nd Company, the Household Guard of Harrowgate." "And what," said Voren, "does a sergeant of the Household Guard of Harrowgate do, Ash?" I want to be exact here, because I have heard this exchange retold in 3 different messes, and it has grown teeth it did not have. He did not answer cleverly. He did not answer at all at first. He set his bag down, squared it with his boot so that it sat parallel to the path, and straightened, and looked at a point 6 inches above Voron's left shoulder, which is where a man of his trade looks, and said, "He stands his post, Sergeant Major." "He stands his post," Voron repeated, "to the rain, to me, to the uplands generally. There it is. 19 years I've been asking men what they can do, and finally one of them tells me the truth." Ash said nothing. "You'll be gone by gate 2, Voron said. "Yes, Sergeant Major," said Ash, "and here is the thing that stayed with me, and I did not understand it for 4 days. He did not say it as a man swallowing an insult. He said it the way you say *yes to a fact about the weather. As though whether he would be gone by gate 2 was a matter for the mountain to decide and no part of his business, and he had already put it out of his mind, and was thinking about something else entirely, and that something else was probably the correct alignment of his kit bag." Voron walked away. I stayed because it was my job to process him, and because I was already composing the line I would write in the box. "Sergeant Ash," I said, "I'm Captain Farrow, Gate 4. Why are you here?" He looked at me for the first time. He had the pale, weather-scoured face of a man who spends a great deal of time outdoors doing nothing, and gray eyes that did not blink at the rain, and he was, I would guess, 34 or 35. "I was sent, sir," he said. "That is reason enough. Ornament, recommend refuse." I wrote it in the guardroom with my boots up on the stove rail, and I read it out to 2 of the other directing staff, and they laughed, and one of them, Lieutenant Marta Salve, our senior medic, who is a better human being than I was and knew it, did not laugh, and said, "You'll want to tear that up later," and went to check her stretchers. I did not tear it up. I have it still. That is, I suppose, the point of this account. Now, how does a ceremonial guardsman from a kingdom 400 miles west end up at the foot of the Velhold Hill in the rain? I was not there for the beginning of it. What I set down here I have from the letters between our war ministry and theirs, from the testimony given at the inquiry, and from a woman who had been in the room and who told me the truth in about 9 sentences, and then changed the subject. It began at a state banquet in Harrowgate. Brigadier Ostrek Halm was our military attaché to the Kingdom of Eldermore. I knew him by reputation, a tall, groomed, glittering man who had commanded a battalion once briefly, and had been an ambassador ever since, and who had learned that a soldier's reputation is a kind of currency that can be spent at dinner tables. He had come up through the gray pikes. He wore the gray cord at his shoulder every day of his life, including, I am told, in bed. At this banquet, the Household Guard of Harrowgate had performed the ceremony they perform, the slow march, the arms drill, the whole silver machinery of it, and the guests had applauded, and Brigadier Halm had leaned back in his chair with a glass in his hand and delivered himself of an opinion. "Exquisite," he said, "truly, I have never seen porcelain move so beautifully." There was a laugh at his end of the table, not a large one, enough. "You must forgive a fighting man," Halm went on. "It is a professional deformity. I look at those magnificent fellows in their red coats and their tall hats, and I do not see soldiers. I see a very fine ornament on a very fine mantelpiece. And I ask myself, what becomes of a beautiful object like that if you take it down and put it out in the weather?" He smiled. He had excellent teeth. "It cracks, I think. I say this with the greatest respect." Crown Prince Rowan of Eldermore was 26 years old that year, and had not yet learned to let a thing go by. I am told he set down his fork very carefully. "Then take one down, Brigadier," he said. The table went quiet in the way tables do. "I beg your pardon, Your Highness." "You have a course," said the Crown Prince. "Everyone knows you have a course. You mention it, I think, twice per dinner, So take one of my father's ornaments off the mantelpiece and put it out in your weather, and let us all find out whether it cracks." Helm laughed. He was by all accounts delighted. He had been handed a gift, and he knew exactly what it was worth. A guardsman in a red coat, filmed and photographed climbing off the Skarn in tears at Gate 2, would be worth a year of dinners to him. It would be worth a paragraph in every paper on our side of the border. "The ornament cracks." "Your Highness," he said, "we would be honored." And that would have been the end of it. A young man's temper, an old man's vanity, a story for the household to shudder about, except that King Alaric had been listening. He had been listening the way he listens, which is to say without appearing to. He is not a loud king. He let the table talk for a minute or two, and then he set down his glass, and the table found that it had stopped talking. "My son has made you an offer, brigadier," he said, "and my son is not yet in a position to make offers. So I will make it instead, and I will make it properly, and you will find it a good deal less amusing. Sire, one man of my household guard will attend your reckoning as a guest of your army. He will not go as a wager. There is no wager. If there is money on this in any mess in Kastrell, I will know of it, and I will withdraw him." The king's voice did not rise. It never does. "He will not go to prove anything to you. He will go because I have asked him to, and because standing where he is put is his trade. He will carry no message and no boast. If he fails, he fails, and he will come home to his post, and I will think no less of him, and neither will anyone in this kingdom who has ever stood 8 hours in the rain at a gate that nobody was trying to come through. Do you understand the distinction I am drawing, brigadier?" Helm, I am told, said that he did. He did not. That was the whole of the trouble. The choosing of the man was done by the king's sister. Princess Adela is not a woman who attends banquets if she can avoid it, and she had not attended that one, and she heard about it the following morning while inspecting a stable, and she is said to have put down a hoof pick and stood for a while looking at the middle distance. The household guard has, in that kingdom, a thing they call the long vigil. When a member of the royal family lies in state, the guard mounts a watch over the coffin, in shifts, day and night, until the burial. It is the heaviest duty they have. The men who do it stand with reversed arms, heads bowed, in a hall full of mourners who file past all day and all night, and they do not move, and they are not permitted to move, and it goes on for days. When the late Queen Mother Rosalind lay in state 3 years before, the vigil ran for 4 days. The relief schedule broke on the 3rd night. 2 men were taken ill. The reserve company was on the far side of the country at a review. A sergeant of the 2nd company stood a double shift, and then, when the man who should have relieved him did not come, he stood a 3rd. 30 hours and 40 minutes in the end, on stone, in a hall of strangers, without food, without a word, without shifting the position of his feet. When they finally took him off, he could not unbend his hands from the rifle, and 2 of his own corporals had to carry him out through the service door so that the mourners would not see. He was back on the gate 4 days later. Princess Adela had been in that hall. She had watched him from a gallery for an hour in the small hours of the 3rd night, when the queue had thinned, and the great room was nothing but candles and echo and one man standing in it. And she had gone away and made a note of his name, as she makes a note of everything. "Send Ash," she said, over the stable door, "and do not tell him what it is about. Tell him it is a post." They told him it was a post. That is the second thing I did not know when I wrote *ornament* on his card, that the man in the rain at the bottom of my hill had not come to Kastrell to prove anything, or to win anything, or to answer Brigadier Helm. He had been told there was a place he was required to stand. He had come to stand in it. The reckoning began at 4 in the morning on the 13th, with 158 candidates on the start line in the dark, under the lamps, in a wind that was taking the rain up the mountain rather than down it. The candidates stood in ranks by number. Number 41 stood in the 3rd rank, in Kastrell and issue kit, We had stripped him of every scrap of his own, down to the socks. Vorin had been very thorough about that, and in the dark, under the lamps, with a black rain running off 158 bare heads, he was indistinguishable from any other man there. Except that he was still. I do not mean he was standing at attention. Every man on that line was standing at attention, more or less, and every one of them was doing the small hopeless things men do in cold and fear, rocking a heel, working a shoulder under a strap, blowing into cupped hands, turning the head a half-inch at every sound. 157 men vibrating quietly in the dark like a struck wire. And one man in the third rank standing the way a bollard stands. Vorin saw it too. I watched him see it. He walked the line with a lamp, and when he came to 41 he stopped, and he held the lamp up, and he looked at him for a long moment, and I saw something cross that granite face that was not contempt and was not amusement. It was the look of a man who has found a stone in his boot and does not yet know how it got there. Then he moved on, and the horn went, and the reckoning took them. Behind the start line in the warm, with a mug of something in his hand, Brigadier Ostrek Helm, who had driven up from the capital the evening before, to watch, he said, on behalf of the ministry, leaned to Colonel Brant Osk, the commandant of Velhold, and said something and laughed. Osk did not laugh. He was a spare, silent, disliked man who ran Velhold as an act of faith, and he watched 158 lamps go up the Black Hill, and he said nothing at all. The betting book in the directing staff's mess, which was not supposed to exist, had 41 down at 40-1. I put money on Gate 2. Gate 1 was called the ladder, and it was not subtle. 11 miles of rising ground from the start line to the shoulder of a hill called Skellet, the last two at an angle that made men use their hands, 60 pounds on every back, cut off 5 hours and 40 minutes. It was designed to take a third of them off the mountain before breakfast. Velhold's philosophy had been unchanged for a century. We did not want to spend 4 days finding out that a man could not do this. I was not on Gate 1. I was at Gate 4, which came later, so I had the morning to stand in the tower with a field glass and watch the line of them break apart on the ladder like a wave going up shingle. They came apart quickly. Nobody outside imagines it right. They picture heroic sufferings, men on their knees at the summit. It is quiet and it is administrative. A man slows. He stops to fix a strap and stops again, and the tail of the column goes by him, and something in his face changes. You can see it through the glass at 800 yards the exact moment it happens, and then he sits down on a rock. He has decided. He will get up and walk in, but the deciding is done. The DS on the hill do not shout at him. There is nothing to shout at. They write a number in a book. 51 men wrote themselves into that book on the first morning. I found 41 at about the 7-mile mark in the middle of the field and lost him, and found him again and lost him, and could not for the life of me work out what he was doing. He was not fast. He was nowhere near the front, where the Ortown boys were burning themselves out in a way that would cost them dearly on day 3. He was not slow. He simply went asterisk up asterisk at one speed with an unvarying pace, and the thing that made him hard to track through a glass was that he never changed anything. He did not stop to adjust. He did not swap the rifle from hand to hand. He did not look at the summit. Men who look at the summit are measuring their misery against the distance left, and the measurement always comes out badly. He looked at the ground 4 feet in front of him, and he put one boot into it and then the other, and the mountain went by underneath him at a rate that seemed insultingly modest, until you noticed that he was passing people. He came in at 4 hours 51, 43rd of the 107 who finished. Mid-pack, said Vorin when the times went up. Well, it walks. He said it loudly in the hut where the candidates were eating, and there was a laugh from the tables, and 41 went on eating with the terrible unhurried economy of a man who has learned to eat cold food fast in an alley behind a palace between guard mounts. Give it its name, then, said one of the Ortown boys, A big, likable, hopeless lad who would be gone by the third night. What do we call it? Call it the Plume, said Vorin. And so, from the first morning of the reckoning, the man from Eldermore was the Plume. It followed him across the whole mountain. It was chanted at him on the fords. It was written on the wall of the drying room. I would like to tell you that I stopped it, and I did not, and 11 years is not long enough to make that sit any easier. 2 candidates mattered to what came after, and I will introduce them now. The first was candidate 12, Reuel Vashek, the favorite, and he knew it, and being the favorite of a place like Velhold does terrible things to a man. 28, an athlete from a family with 3 gray cords in it, and he had trained 4 years for the reckoning the way other men train for a championship. He led the latter by 11 minutes. He was also the loudest voice at the Plume's back, and I understood exactly why, because I had been that man at 24. He had spent 4 years building an idea of what this mountain would prove about him, and if a candlestick from a foreign palace could finish it, then perhaps the mountain was not what he had needed it to be. The second was candidate 90, Jory Ilk. He was a farrier's son from the low country, 22 years old, 5'6" and built out of wire, and he had no business whatever being on that hill. He had failed the entrance standard twice and been let on at the 3rd attempt by a clerical mercy. He talked when he was frightened, which was constantly. He talked to anybody. On the second morning at the water point, he talked to the Plume. I was 10 feet away, filling my own flask, and I heard the whole of it. "They say you stand outside a palace," said Ilk. "Yes. All day. 2 hours on 4 off, longer unceremonial." "What do you do?" "Nothing." Ilk thought about this. He had a face that showed you every thought it had, which is a fine quality in a friend and a disastrous one in a soldier. "That send me mad," he said. Ash tightened the cap on his water skin and set it on his belt in the one correct place it went. "It does," he said, "for about the first year." That was, as far as I know, the longest conversation Corwin Ash had with anyone during the first 3 days of the reckoning. Gate 2 was the cold fords, and Gate 2 was where I lost my money. The Skarn drains through a chain of 9 river crossings in a valley called the Cauldron, and the second gate sends the candidates down into it at dusk to cross all 9, in order, in full kit, and climb out the far side by midnight. The 9th ford is chest deep. The point of the exercise is not the crossing. Any fit man can cross a river. The point is the 4 hours after it, when you are wet to the bone in a wind on an open hillside, carrying 60 pounds in the dark, and your body spends everything it has on the single task of keeping your heart warm, and there is nothing left over for your judgment, and a great many men perfectly capable of walking simply stop wanting to. 22 went out on the cold fords. That is a normal number. Solveig's medics worked all night with hot fluids and blankets, and none of it was heroic, and if you want to know what a hard course actually looks like, it looks like a 22-year-old sitting in a foil blanket in a tent at 1 in the morning, shaking, being told very kindly that he has not failed at life. I was on the bank at the 8th ford with a lamp, counting them through. The Plume came down the bank in the dark in the middle of a group of 6, and I watched him go into that water, and I have thought about it ever since. Every man goes into cold water the same way. He gasps. It is not cowardice. It is a reflex older than courage, and it costs you, because the gasp takes your breath and then you spend the crossing trying to get it back, and you come out the other side with your chest locked and your hands shaking and your body already losing the argument. Ash walked in the way you would walk into a room. He did not gasp. He went down into it to the chest, and his face did not alter and his breathing did not alter, and he took the crossing at the same unvarying pace at which he had gone up the ladder, and he came out on my bank streaming, and he stopped, and he stood, and he did the strangest thing I have ever seen a man do on that riverbank. He *settled. I can put it no better. He stood in the wind, soaked in the dark, at 11 at night on the Skarn, and he squared his feet, and his shoulders came down and back, and his hands came to rest, and every unnecessary motion went out of him, and he stood there for perhaps 4 seconds like a man on a parade square waiting for a king to walk past. And then he picked up his load and went on. The men around him were juddering. That is the word. Cold makes a man's whole body juggle itself, hunting for warmth, and it eats his strength, and he cannot help it, and he does not know he is doing it. Ash did not shiver. I went a salve about it, in the medical tent at 2 in the morning, and I asked her, in the tone of a man expecting a piece of gossip, how a soaked man on a cold hill fails to shiver. She did not look up from the flask she was filling. Because he isn't fighting it, she said. Nobody can decide not to shiver, Marta. No, but you can decide not to panic, and shivering that hard is mostly panic wearing a coat. She screwed the cap down. Pharaoh, what does that man do for a living? He stands outside a palace and gets photographed. Yes, she said, for 10 years in every kind of weather, without moving, without eating, without complaining, without being allowed to react to anything at all. Do you understand what I have just described to you? I said that I did not. You've just described the finest cold and boredom training program on the continent, she said, and I'd very much like to know why we're all laughing at it. I told her she'd gone soft. I want that on the page. It is the sort of thing a man edits out when he tells the story at dinner. Lieutenant Marta Salve worked out what Corwin Ash was on the second night of the reckoning, and told me plainly, and I told her she had gone soft, and I slept for 4 hours and did not think about it again for 2 days. Gate 3 was the ash fields, and Gate 3 was where Voren began to hunt him. The ash fields are 11 square miles of broken volcanic ground above the tree line, black scree, hollows, no landmarks worth the name, and a compass that lies to you in 3 places because of the iron in the rock. 6 checkpoints at night, unaccompanied. It is the gate that catches the men who can suffer but cannot think. Suffering is common. Thinking at the 4th hour of the 3rd night, when you have slept 90 minutes since the start line and your hands will not fold a map, is rare. Ash came through Gate 3 4th, not 44th, 4th. And that is the point at which Velhold stopped laughing and began, in a way I have never been proud of, to close ranks. You must understand what he was to us by then. The betting book had him at 40-1, and a great many people had money in that book. Voren had told the candidates that the Plume would be gone by Gate 2, and Voren had been at Velhold 19 years and had never once been wrong about a man on the first morning. And Brigadier Halm was still in the commandant's guest quarters, and every evening at dinner he asked, in a voice of the purest concern, how the elder gentleman was bearing up, poor fellow, and whether we might think about withdrawing him for his own protection. Halm had come to see a candlestick break. He had 4 days left and it was not breaking, and he began, I saw this happen, to stop finding it funny. Voren's method was not brutality. Velhold was not a cruel place. It was a hard place run by hard men who had never in my hearing laid a finger on a candidate in anger. What Voren did was entirely within the rules, and that is precisely why it worked. He inspected him. Kit is inspected at every gate. A missing item is penalized in minutes, 3 penalties in a gate and a man is withdrawn. It is a fair rule and it exists for a good reason. A soldier who loses his kit on a mountain kills somebody eventually, and it is also in the hands of a determined sergeant major, a knife. At Gate 3's inspection, in the sleet at 4 in the morning, with 101 exhausted men laid out on the black scree with their kit in rows in front of them, Sergeant Major Hesk Voren spent 11 minutes on candidate, 41 and 8 seconds on everybody else. He went through that man's pack item by item. He made him lay out his rations and count them aloud. He held up a spare sock and turned it inside out and looked at it against the lamp. He counted the rounds in the ammunition pouch twice, and then a third time. He unrolled the bivouac sheet and shook it out into the sleet and handed it back to him wet. He asked him to name the 6 checkpoints in order, and then to name them in reverse order, and then to state the grid of the third one, which no candidate on that mountain could have done and which Ash did. And Corwin Ash lay on the black stones in the sleet at 4 in the morning at the end of the third night of the reckoning of Kastrell, and answered every question in the same level, unhurried, unbothered voice. And when it was finished, he repacked his kit in the correct order with hands I could see were not entirely under his control, and stood up, and stood there. Voren looked at him for a long moment. "You think you're something," he said. "No, Sergeant Major. You think you're going to walk off my mountain with a gray cord and go home and tell them all what you did to us." "No, Sergeant Major." "Then what?" said Voren, and there was something in his voice I did not recognize. "Are you asterisk for asterisk man?" And Corwin Ash said the only unnecessary sentence I ever heard him speak on that course. "A gate's an ornament too, Sergeant Major," he said, "until somebody tries to walk through it." Nobody laughed. 101 men lay in the sleet and heard it, and nobody laughed, and I saw Reuel Vashek, 4 places down the line, turn his head and look at the Plume for a long moment with an expression I could not read. Voren said, 15-minute penalty. Bivouac sheet incorrectly stowed. And walked away. The bivouac sheet had been correctly stowed. Voren had unrolled it himself. I noted the penalty in my book because it was my job to note penalties in my book, and I told myself, walking down off the ash fields in the gray of the 4th dawn, that 15 minutes was nothing, that the man had it in hand, that it was not my gate and not my business. I have spent 11 years being tired of that sentence. Gate 4 was mine, and Gate 4 was the carry. It is the gate everybody outside the army has heard of, and everybody inside the army dreads, and it is the only one I have ever seen make a grown man weep on the way asterisk in rather than on the way out. The premise is this. At the halfway point, the surviving candidates are formed into teams of 6, and each team is given a line on a map, 8.5 miles over the Vane Ridge and a load, and the load must arrive. The load is a stretcher, and on the stretcher is 180 pounds of sandbag, strapped and dressed to the approximate shape of a man, because Velhold has never been coy about what the exercise is for. In the winter of the founding year, an avalanche took the better part of a company on the Skelet's shoulder, and the men who went up to bring them down were the men who could carry, and the men who could not carry stood at the bottom of the hill and listened. The rules of the carry are few, and they are absolute. The stretcher does not touch the ground between the start and the finish. Every man in the team carries. There is no passenger. If a man falls out, the team does not lose his weight, it gains it because his kit goes onto the stretcher, and the team is scored as a team. 6 pass or 6 fail. You will see already why the carry is the place to break a man you cannot break alone. I did not at first see it. I am not going to pretend that I did. What I saw at 5:30 on the morning of the 4th day was Sergeant Major Voren reading out the teams from a clipboard, and Team 9 coming out as follows: Vashek, Ilk, Ash, and 3 men from a low country regiment who had been on the ladder in the very last group under the cutoff, and who were, all 3, visibly finished men running on nothing but the horror of going home. The strongest man on the course, the weakest man on the course, the foreigner, and 3 men who should already have been off the mountain. And I stood there with my board under my arm and thought, that is an unlucky team. Then Voren said, Team 9, weigh in. And I went to the scales because weighing in the loads was my gait and my job, and I watched Corporal Ivan Das of the directing staff put Team 9's stretcher on the plate, and I watched the needle, and the needle went to 231 pounds. The standard load is 180. I said, Das, that's 51 over. Das was a decent man and a poor liar, and he did not look at me. "Sergeant Major's compliments, sir," he said. "It's a wet bag." "It's a wet bag," I repeated. "Been out in the rain, sir. They soak up." "They do soak up. A canvas sandbag left out in Skarn rain for a week will take on perhaps 12 pounds. It will not take on 51, and the other 7 stretchers on the plate that morning went 4 pounds each over standard, which is exactly what a wet bag does." I looked at the stretcher. Somebody had opened the seam at the head end and closed it again, not badly. Now I am going to be honest, because this is the part of the account that matters, and I have had 11 years to dress it up. I did not report it. I stood on the scale platform at Gate 4 with the evidence under my hand, and I built, in about 90 seconds, the whole magnificent architecture of a coward's reasoning. That Voren had 19 years at Velhold and I had 2. That Voren had carried me off the ash fields on his own back when I failed at 24, which is a debt with no expiry date. That the brigadier was grey pikes and the ministry was full of grey pikes, and I was a captain with an ambition. That the man would be off the mountain by noon anyway. That it was, in the end, only 51 pounds. I wrote 231 in the load column. I initialed it, and I sent Team 9 up the Vane Ridge. They took 9 hours and 40 minutes. The carry cutoff is 9 hours. Team 9 came in 40 minutes over, and every man in Team 9 should therefore have failed, and I am coming to that. But first I have to tell you what happened on the ridge, because I did not see it, and everything I know I have from Reuel Vashek, who told it to me 2 days later in a voice I had never heard him use. They went up strong for 2 miles. Vashek set the pace, because of course he did. Then the first of the Low Country men went down, not dramatically, just sat down in the heather and could not get up again and was taken by the DS. His kit went on the stretcher, that is the rule. 2 miles later the second one went, and his kit went on the stretcher. And now there were 4 of them carrying a load that had begun 51 pounds over standard and had since gained 110 pounds of abandoned equipment. Up a ridge, in the 5th hour, on the 4th day, having slept a total of 4 hours since the start line. At the crest, the 3rd Low Country man stopped. He did not sit. He simply stopped walking with the stretcher in his hands, which is worse because the stretcher does not stop, and he went over sideways, and Vashek, this is Vashek's account, Vashek screamed at him, called him everything, stood over a finished man on a ridge in the rain and told him what he was. And then Vashek said, "The Plume put the stretcher down." I said, "He what?" "He put it down," Vashek said, "on the ground, which is the one thing you cannot do. 9 hours of carrying, and he set it on the stones and stood up and looked at me." And Corwin Ash said to Reuel Vashek on the Vane Ridge in the rain, "The load can wait, he can't." And then he knelt down in front of the man from the Low Country, who was not injured and was not ill and was simply used up, and he did not shout at him, and he did not encourage him, and he did not tell him he could do it. He took the man's hands and he turned them over and he looked at them and he said, "You've been carrying with your fingers. Nobody told you." And he showed him. Vashek was very precise about this, and I could see the thing in his own hands as he described it. He showed him how to hang the weight from the frame of the body rather than grip it with the hand, which is the first thing a household guardsman is taught about carrying a rifle for 8 hours, and the last thing that occurs to a strong young man in a hurry. He gave him 4 minutes, Vashek said. 4 minutes we didn't have. Then we picked it up and we went on, and the man walked in with us. "You went 40 minutes over the cutoff," I said. "Yes." "You failed the gate." "Yes," said Reuel Vashek, and then he said, "Captain, we came in with 6. Now the scoring of Gate 4. The cutoff is the cutoff. Team 9 came in 40 minutes late, and Team 9 was therefore out, all 6 of them, and that would have been the end of the reckoning for Candidate 41. No scandal, no rigging anyone could point to, nothing but a clock and a rule. It was tidy. It was so tidy that when Voren looked at the clock he did not even look pleased. He looked, I thought, faintly ill. And Colonel Brant Osk, who had come down to Gate 4 in his old coat with no insignia on it, because he came down to Gate 4 every year and nobody had ever known why, said, "Pharaoh, bring me the load sheet." I brought him the load sheet. He read it. He read the column with 231 in it and my initials beside it. He looked at the 7 other numbers on the sheet. He was silent for a length of time that I would not care to live through twice. "Wet bag," he said. "That is what I was told, sir." "By whom?" There it was, laid out in front of me like a kit inspection. And I heard myself say, "I don't remember, sir." Colonel Osk handed me back the load sheet, and he looked at me the way a man looks at a fence post he has just discovered is rotten, and he said, quite mildly, "Then you had better start remembering, Captain, because in about an hour I am going to have to decide whether this course of ours is a test or a performance, and I would like to know which of my officers I can ask." And he walked away up the hill to where Team 9 were sitting in the rain in a row with a stretcher in front of them, and he stood over them for a while, and then he did something that Velhold had not seen a commandant do in living memory. He picked up the stretcher. He weighed it in his own hands, a spare, 58-year-old man in a coat with no badges on it, and he set it down again, and he said something to the 6 of them that I was too far away to hear, and Vashek told me afterwards what it was. It was, "Who put the sheet down?" And Vashek said Ash did not answer, and the Low Country man did, and the Low Country man was weeping by then, which does not matter, and I only mention it because Vashek could not tell me the story without mentioning it either. Colonel Osk's ruling on Gate 4 was posted in the drying room at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and it read, in full, "Team 9, load found to be 51 lb over standard. Overage was not the candidate's doing. Time adjusted accordingly, cutoff met, all 6 advance." The stretcher was placed on the ground for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The directing staff record that this was done to prevent an exhausted man from falling on a ridge. The directing staff record no penalty. Candidates are reminded that the rules of the carry exist to teach them that the load matters. They do not exist to teach them that it matters more than the man carrying it. Bosk call compt. I read that notice standing between 2 candidates who could not stand up straight, and I felt the floor of my career quietly give way beneath me, and I deserved it. That evening Brigadier Ostrek Halm asked for a private word with the commandant, and got one, and I know what was said in it because Colonel Osk repeated it, word for word, in front of a board of inquiry 11 weeks later, with Halm sitting 6 feet away from him. Halm began with the reputation of the reckoning. He spoke about standards. He said that a course which adjusted its own cutoffs on the day, out of sentiment, in front of a foreign guest, was not a course but a courtesy, and that people in the capital would draw conclusions, and that the Grey Pikes had spent 90 years building something that a single indulgent afternoon could spend. And Colonel Osk said, "You have not asked me what he actually did on the ridge." And Halm said, and this is the sentence I would carve into the wall of every officer's mess in the world, if I had the authority, Halm said, "I do not care what he did on the ridge, Colonel. I care what it will look like." There was a silence. Osk let it run. Then he said, "He will be at Gate 9 on the 5th night, Brigadier, with the rest of them. And whatever it looks like, I am afraid it will also be * true, and I have found over the years that the truth is a great deal harder to withdraw than a candidate." Halm left the office, and on his way through the outer room he stopped at the desk of the duty clerk, and asked, in the pleasantest voice imaginable, whether the checkpoint cards from the Ash Fields navigation had been filed yet, because the ministry took a great interest in the paperwork, and he wondered whether he might be permitted to have a look at them. The clerk, who was 19 years old, said, "Yes, sir, of course, sir," and showed him the box. I was in that outer room. I was standing at the notice board with my back to him, pinning up the next day's gate roster. I heard the box open, I heard it close. And I did not turn round. The Ashfield's cards were reconciled on the morning of the 5th day. It is a dull, clerical business. 6 checkpoints, each with a punch of a unique shape, each candidate's card punched at each box, and it exists to catch the 2 or 3 men each year who take a shortcut across the black ground in the dark and think nobody will ever know. Candidate 41's card was short 1 punch, checkpoint 4. I saw the card. I held it in my hand. There were 5 clean punches on it and a 6th position that was blank, and the 5th punch was the star shape from checkpoint 5, which stands at a grid reference that a man cannot reach from the start point without passing within 80 yards of checkpoint 4, unless he swims the cauldron in the dark. Corwin Ash had come through gate 3/4. In the whole field, only 3 men had been ahead of him, and all 3 had punched at 4. He missed a box, said Voren. We were in the DS room. There were 6 of us. Voren had the card in his hand and he was looking at it, and he was not looking at me, and there was a color in his face that had nothing to do with the weather. He came in 4th, I said. You cannot come in 4th having missed checkpoint 4. It's not a shortcut, it's a detour. He missed a box, Voren said again. The card says he missed a box. Am I to argue with the card, Captain? Is that what we do now? Because I have withdrawn 11 men in 19 years on that card, and every one of them told me the machine was wrong, and every one of them was lying. And if I stand here today and say that the card is wrong because I asterisk like the look of the man asterisk, then I have thrown 19 years in the fire, and you may have the fire, and I will go and keep bees. And then Sergeant Major Hesk Voren, who had called that man a candlestick and a joke, and had cost him 15 minutes for a bivouac sheet he had unrolled himself, said something that told me everything about what the previous 4 days had done to him. He said very quietly, "It isn't wrong. Somebody's asterisk made asterisk it wrong." Nobody in that room said anything. He waited. He gave asterisk me a good long moment to say it. I had been standing in the outer room with my back to a man opening a card box, and Voren did not know that, and could not know it, and was standing there in front of 6 officers asking, in the only way a sergeant major can ask, whether one of us was going to be a man about it. And I said nothing, because Halm was a brigadier and I was a captain, and because I had already put 231 on a load sheet and initialed it, and there is no such thing as a small first lie. Voren put the card down. "Withdraw him," he said. "Candidate 41, missed checkpoint. Failed gate 3 retrospective, get him off my mountain." They told him at 11 in the morning of the 5th day, in the drying room, in front of about 40 men. I was there, I made myself be there. It was the least of what I owed, and I have never pretended otherwise. He was sitting on a bench with his boots off, doing the thing that men do on the 5th day, which is to attend to their feet with the grave, unhurried tenderness of a jeweler, because feet are the whole of a man's future at that point. When Voren told him, he stopped, and he put the sock down and he stood up. "Yes, Sergeant Major," he said. That was all. No argument. No protest. Not one word about the 4 days behind him or the 8 hours in front. Not one appeal to Colonel Osk. Not one mention of the fact, which every man in that room knew, that he had come through gate 3 ahead of 100 Kastrellan soldiers. He simply began, standing there on the wooden floor with one boot off, to fold himself back into the shape of a man taking an order. And the drying room did something I have never in my life seen a room full of reckoning candidates do. It got up. Not all at once, and not in any organized way. Reuel Vashek got up first. Vashek, who had led the ladder, who had 4 years and 3 gray cords in his family, who had been the loudest voice at the Plume's back for the first 2 days. He stood up off his bench in his socks with his hair in his eyes, and he said, "Sergeant Major, that card's a lie." "Sit down, Vashek." He was at 4, Sergeant Major. I was at 4. He was ahead of me. He was going out of the box as I was coming into it, and he told me the bearing to 5 because I had it wrong and I'd have gone into the cauldron if he hadn't. Vashek's voice cracked on it, and he was not a man who cracked. You want to withdraw me too, that's fine, but the card is a lie. And then Jory Ilk stood up, which took more from him than it took from Vashek, and said, I saw him at 4 and all, which was not true, and everybody knew it was not true, including Ilk, who was a terrible liar and looked as though he might be sick. And 2 of the Low Country men stood up. And then 8 or 9 others, none of whom had seen anything at all, standing up in their socks in a hot room that smelled of wet wool and feet. 40 men who had been laughing at the Plume 4 days earlier, on their feet in front of a sergeant major, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. Just standing. Corwin Ash looked at them. And this, of everything in the 100 hours, this is the moment I saw the mask move. It was not much. His eyes went along that room, bench by bench, and he was silent, and then he closed them for perhaps a second and a half, and opened them, and it was gone. Sit down, he said, to them, not to the sergeant major, to them. All of you, sit down. They sat down. To this day, I could not tell you why they did, except that when a man who has never once raised his voice says a thing in a certain way, it turns out that you have been waiting all your life to be told what to do by someone who is not enjoying it. Then he turned to Voren, and said the second of the 2 unnecessary sentences I ever heard him speak. Sergeant Major, am I withdrawn from the course, or am I withdrawn from the mountain? Voren said, what's the difference? The course has a number on it, said Corwin Ash. The mountain doesn't. I was sent here to attend your reckoning. I have not attended all of it yet. If I'm out of the scoring, then I'm out of the scoring, and I'll make no complaint about it and no report of it, and I'll say nothing about it at home. But if there is a gate left, I would like to walk it, unscored, with no number and no card and no place on your board. There is no such thing, said Voren, as an unscored man on my course. Then make me a spare stretcher-bearer, said Ash, and I'll carry the water. And Voren, who had never lost an argument in that room in his life, stood there with a punched card in his fist and his jaw working, and finally said, wait here, and went out, and walked across the yard in the rain to the commandant's office, and was in there for 20 minutes. I know now what he said in there, because Colonel Osk told the inquiry. He said, Sir, I am asking to be relieved. And Osk said, on what grounds, Sergeant Major? And Voren said, on the grounds that somebody has interfered with my course, sir, and I have spent 4 days making it easy for them, and I would rather be a fool at the bottom of the hill than a tool at the top of it. Osk did not relieve him. What Osk did was to take a lamp and a coat and walk out to the drying room himself, and stand in the doorway, and look at a foreign soldier with 1 boot on and 1 boot off, and say, Sergeant Ash, do you know what is at gate 9? No, sir. Nobody tells them, said Osk. That is part of it. Would you like me to tell you? No, sir, thank you. Osk nodded slowly, as though a suspicion of his had been confirmed. You will walk it unscored, he said. No number, no card, nothing on the board whatever you do out there. If you stand on that stone until the sun comes up, you will get nothing for it, not a cord, not a certificate, not a line in a file. Do you understand me? You will suffer for exactly nothing. And Corwin Ash said, Sir, I've done that every day for 11 years. I did not understand that answer at the time. I thought it was bitterness or a very dry joke. I have thought about it a great deal since. He was telling the plain truth. He had spent 11 years standing at a gate in a red coat while a country walked past him and photographed him and laughed at him, and most days did not look at him at all. No one ever tried the gate. There was no cord at the end of it and no board with his name on it, and every morning he put the coat on and went back and stood there, because the reward for standing there was that the thing behind him stayed standing. We had spent 5 days trying to find out whether he could suffer for a prize. He had never once suffered for a prize in his life. Gate 9 is called the Anvil. It sits at the top of Velhold, above the camp, above everything. A flat shelf of gray rock about 40 yards by 20, scoured bare, with the whole of the Skarn falling away on 3 sides and nothing above it but the sky. It has been called the Anvil since before there was an army in Kastrell, because that is what the shepherds called it, and the shepherds did not go up there. Cut into the eastern lip of it, in letters a foot high, worn down by 2 centuries of weather until you have to know they are there to see them, is the founding inscription of the reckoning. And the whole of Gate 9 is this. At 9 o'clock on the last night, the surviving candidates, however many are left of the 158, march up onto the anvil, and are placed on marks chalked on the stone, 1 man to a mark, an arm's length apart, facing east. And they stand at attention until the sun comes up. That is all. There is nothing to carry, nothing to climb, nowhere to go. You stand on your mark at attention, and you do not sit, and you do not kneel, and you do not lean, and you do not speak, and you do not leave your mark. And if you do, a directing staff officer takes you off the stone and your reckoning is over, and you may be 4 days and 22 hours into it, and it does not matter in the slightest. Sunrise on the 16th of the cold month at Velhold is at 8 minutes past 7. They go up at 9. 10 hours and 8 minutes. Nobody has ever done it. That is not a figure of speech, and it is not a legend. It is a fact in a ledger. In 91 years, the longest anyone has ever stood on the anvil is 7 hours and 51 minutes, and the man who did it did not pass the reckoning either, because he went down at the end of it and had to be carried, and the rule is that you must be standing when the sun clears the ridge. You are asking the obvious question, how does anyone pass the reckoning at all? Because you are not required to stand until sunrise. You are required to stand until the commandant, watching from the western lip with a lamp, is satisfied, and no candidate is ever told what satisfies him, or when it will come. Men have been taken off the stone at 4 hours and passed, and taken off at 6 and failed. Twice in 91 years, in the bad years, a commandant has let it run to the sunrise and taken nobody at all. The anvil is not a test of endurance. It is a test of a man who does not know how long the thing will last and stands anyway. It is the most elegant and the most cruel piece of soldiering I have ever been part of, and every officer who has ever worn the gray cord has stood on that stone in the dark not knowing, and that is what we have instead of a religion. 31 men marched up onto the anvil at 9 o'clock on the 5th night. 31 had numbers. The 32nd walked up behind them with no number at all, and stood on a mark at the end of the 2nd row that the sergeant major had chalked himself, 20 minutes earlier, on his knees in the dark, with a piece of chalk out of his own pocket. Before they were called on, there were perhaps 10 minutes of waiting at the top, while the DS set the lamps. Most of the candidates stood in a huddle out of the wind with their hands in their armpits, saying nothing. 2 were quietly sick. 1 kept laughing, which is a thing that happens. Corwin Ash walked the anvil. He went round the whole of it, unhurried, the way a man walks a room he is going to have to defend: the north lip, the west lip, the fall of the ground, the chalk marks, the position of the lamps, the direction of the wind. And then he came to the eastern edge, where the shelf goes over into 800 feet of nothing, and he stopped, and he went down on 1 knee. I thought he was tying a lace. He was not. He had found the inscription. He put the flat of his glove against the stone and moved it slowly along, the way you would read a thing with your hand because your eyes have been open for 5 days, and he stayed there a while, and then he stood up and went to his mark. I had passed the reckoning on that rock at the age of 26. I had stood on it for 6 hours and 20 minutes in a snow squall, and I had wept when they took me off it, and I have never been prouder of anything in my life. I could not have told you there was writing on it. They went on at 9 o'clock. 32 men on chalk marks, an arm's length apart in 5 rows, facing east into the black. Behind them, at the western lip, the DS lamps and a canvas windbreak, and Colonel Osk with his glass and his own lamp on a pole, which he would lift when he was satisfied and not before. Beside him, in a fur collar, with a flask, Brigadier Ostrek Helm. The temperature on the anvil that night went to 9 below. There was no snow to speak of. There was wind, and there was the cold, and there were 10 hours and 8 minutes of it, and there was nothing whatever to do but stand. The first hour is easy, and every man on the stone knows it is easy, and that is what makes it terrible. The second hour is when the body begins to send its messages. The third is when the mind begins to answer them. In the fourth, the arguments start, good, reasonable, well-constructed arguments, in your own voice. That a man who has come this far has proved it already. That the colonel will lift the lamp in 10 minutes anyway, so what can it matter if you sit for those 10 minutes? In the fifth hour you stop arguing and simply begin to leave. Not to fall, to leave, to go somewhere else inside your own skull, and let the body get on with it, and that hour either saves you or finishes you, and there is no way to know in advance which. 6 went in the second hour. 4 more in the third. One was the big, likable Ortown lad who had asked what they should call the Plume, and he went down without a sound, and 2 DS caught him under the arms before he hit, which is what the DS are there for, and he wept all the way down the hill. By midnight there were 19 on the stone. By 2 o'clock there were 12. I was on the line with the lamp crew. It was my job to walk the rows every 15 minutes and look at faces, and take off the men who were done, and I had done it before, and it had never once cost me a night's sleep. At 2 in the morning I walked the second row and came to the last mark, the one Voren had chalked with his own hand, and I put the lamp up. He was standing at attention. Heels together, hands at the seams of his trousers, chin level, eyes to the front. 5 days on the Skarn, 68 miles, 9 hours of it standing on a rock at 9 below, and the man was standing the way he had stood at the bottom of the hill in the rain on the first morning, and there was frost in his eyebrows and his lips were gray, and his hands were absolutely still. Not rigid. That is what I want you to understand, because rigid is what the rest of us do, and rigid is what kills you out there. He was not clenched. He was set asterisk, the way a bridge is set. Everything the man had was going into the fewest possible places, and every part of him that did not need to be doing anything was doing nothing at all, and he was burning less on that stone than any other man on it. And he had been practicing it 2 hours a day, 4 hours a day, some days 8, for 11 years, at a gate nobody ever tried to walk through. I lowered the lamp, and I went and found Colonel Osk at the windbreak, and I told him everything. I told him about the scales at gate 4, and the 51 pounds, and the wet bag that was not a wet bag, and my initials on the load sheet. I told him I had stood at the notice board in the outer room with my back turned, while somebody opened the card box, and I told him who it had been. I told him I had known at the time exactly what I was doing, and that I had done it because Brigadier Helm was a brigadier, and I wanted to be a major. Helm was standing 8 feet away and heard the whole of it. He said, "This officer is hysterical. He has been awake for 5 days." Colonel Osk did not look at him. He was watching the stone. He said, "Captain Pharaoh, go back to your rows and walk them, every 15 minutes as ordered until the sun comes up or I lift this lamp. That is not a punishment. It will feel like one." It did. At 4 o'clock there were 8. At 4:30 Sergeant Major Voren came up the hill with a card in a paper envelope, and a 19-year-old duty clerk walking behind him, white to the lips, and the 3 of them, Voren, the clerk, and the colonel, put their heads together at the windbreak for perhaps 4 minutes. I learned afterwards what was in the envelope. Candidate 41's Ashfield's card was filled out in ink. Every card issued at that start line is filled out by the candidate himself, at the table, with the stub of pencil that is handed to him with it, because you do not give a man a pen to take onto a wet mountain. 158 cards came off the ash fields, and 157 of them were pencil, and every one of them came back creased and gray and soft as cloth from 5 hours in a man's breast pocket in the rain. Card 41 was ink, and it was crisp, and its 5 punch marks were all of them driven clean through with the same neat pressure, in a warm room, by a man in no particular hurry. The punches themselves had come down off the black ground that morning on their chains, and had been lying in a tray in the store, waiting to be signed back into the armory. And a 19-year-old clerk, who had spent 36 hours being sick with himself, had come to the sergeant major to say that he had shown a very senior officer the card box, and that he did not think he had done anything wrong, sir, and that he had not been able to sleep. At the windbreak, Colonel Brant Osk turned to Brigadier Ostrich Helm and said one sentence, which I did not hear, and Helm's driver brought his car round to the bottom of the hill, and it sat there for the rest of the night with the engine off. At 5:30, there were 6 men left on the anvil. Reuel Vashek was one of them, Corwin Ash was one of them. And 3 marks in from the eastern lip, on the front row, 22 years old and 5'6" and made out of wire, was candidate 90, Jory Ilk, who had failed the entrance standard twice and been let on out of a clerk's mercy, and who had now stood on that rock for 8.5 hours. I saw him go. I was 15 yards away with the lamp, and I saw the whole of it, and I could not get there. He did not fall. That is the thing about the cold at the end of a course like that. It does not knock men down, it empties them, and what I saw was a young man's face go slack, and his eyes go somewhere else, and his knees start to travel, very slowly, in a direction that his body was no longer supervising, and he was 3 feet from the eastern lip of the anvil, and the eastern lip of the anvil goes down 800 feet. The DS on that side was a corporal called Das, and he was 30 yards away at the lamp line. And a man in the second row who had been standing at attention on a chalk mark for 8.5 hours in the freezing dark, unscored, with nothing to win and nothing to lose and no number and no card and no place on any board in the world, came off his mark. He crossed 4 feet of stone in 2 steps and got a hand into the back of Jory Ilk's collar and one under his arm and turned him inward, away from the drop, and took his weight, and went down onto one knee with him under the lamps, and held him there. There was not a sound on the anvil. 31 men had been taken off that stone since 9 o'clock, and not one of them had made a noise, and the 5 who were left did not make one now. The sergeant major was there in 6 seconds, and Solveig's people in 20, and they took Jory Ilk off the rock in a blanket and got him down to the tent, and got him warm, and he was sitting up and talking within the hour and eating within 2, and he was on the parade square 4 days later, and there is nothing more to say about that except that if the man on the second row had not moved, there would have been. Corwin Ash stood up. He looked at the stretcher going away down the hill. He looked at Voren. And then he turned round and walked back across 4 feet of frozen stone, and put his heels together on a chalk mark that no longer meant anything at all, and squared his shoulders, and lifted his chin, and stood at attention facing east into the dark. He had been off his mark for 9 minutes. It was 5:45 in the morning. There was an hour and 23 minutes to sunrise. He stood every one of them. Colonel Brant Osk never lifted the lamp. At 7:08 on the morning of the 16th of the cold month, the sun came up over the ridge behind the anvil and put a long red light across the stone, and there were 5 numbered men standing on their marks, and a 6th at the end of the second row with no number at all, and it was the smallest passing intake at Velhold in 31 years. I have watched a great many things in my life. I have never watched anything like the DS on that rock at sunrise. 19 years of Sergeant Major Hesk Voren went off his face like a coat coming off a peg, and he walked out onto the anvil in front of 6 men who could barely see him, and he came to attention, and he saluted them. And his voice, when it came, was not the voice that took paint off iron. He said, "Gentlemen, stand at ease." 4 of them could not. Their bodies had forgotten how. The DS went among them and unlocked them, arm by arm, the way you would fold up a chair. Reuel Vashek came off his mark and stood swaying and looked at the end of the second row and could not speak. And Corwin Ash of the Household Guard of Harrowgate stood at ease, on his mark, in the sunrise, and waited to be dismissed. The board sat at 11 that morning in the commandant's office, and I was called to it, and I gave my evidence, and I did not spare myself. Voren gave his. The clerk gave his. The card was on the table in its envelope in ink. Brigadier Ostrek Helm was not present. He had been driven down to the capital at first light, at the commandant's request, with a written report following him in a sealed bag, and the board of inquiry that met 11 weeks later removed him from the ministry and struck him from the roll of the Grey Pikes, and censured him in terms that are read out to this day to every officer who takes up an attaché's post. He was not a criminal. He was something our army had not, until then, had a word for. He was a man who had cared what it would look like. Corporal Ivan Das was reprimanded. I was reprimanded and lost my seniority, and did not become a major for 6 years. And I wanted on this page that the loss was not a hardship, and the reprimand was not a hardship, and that the only thing in that whole affair which has ever cost me a night's sleep is a card in a desk drawer with the word *ornament* on it. Then came the matter of Candidate 41, who was not Candidate 41, because Candidate 41 had been withdrawn from the course on a forged card. Colonel Osk restored the number. That much was simple arithmetic, and no one argued it. Ash had come forth through the ash fields. The punches at checkpoint 4 had recorded 98 passages, and the tally at the box matched 98 men, and there was an end to it. What could not be argued so easily was the anvil. Because the rule of Gate 9 is the plainest rule in the Kastrell Field Army. You do not leave your mark. It is not a guideline. It is the entire content of the gate. A man who leaves his mark has failed Gate 9, and there are no circumstances, and there is no appeal, and it has been so for 91 years, and I could name you 11 men who were taken off that stone for stepping 6 inches to the left. He had left his mark. He had left it for 9 minutes, in front of 30 witnesses and 5 directing staff officers, and he had said so himself, standing in front of the board at 11 in the morning after 5 days on a mountain and a night on a rock, when they asked him. "Yes, sir. I came off my mark." "Why?" And Corwin Ash said, "There was a man going over the edge, sir." The board went round it for half an hour. 2 of the members wanted the pass. 1 wanted the rule. It was going, I think, to end badly, in the way these things end, with a special mention, a commendation, a letter to his king, and no cord, and I could see Voren's jaw working at the back of the room. Then Colonel Brant Osk stood up and put on his coat, the old one, with no insignia on it, and said, "Come up the hill, all of you." The anvil at noon on the 6th day was a bare gray shelf with a chalk mark on it, and 11 officers of the Kastrell Field Army standing on it in the wind, feeling foolish. Colonel Osk walked to the eastern lip and knelt down and swept the frost out of the carved letters with the edge of his glove, and stood back and said, "Read it." Nobody moved. "Read it, gentlemen," he said. "You have all stood here. Not one of you has ever read it." So we read it. 2 centuries of Skarn weather had been at it, and you had to know the letters were there, and once you knew, you could not unsee them. "This stone is not worth a man." "That is the founding line of the reckoning," said Osk. "It was cut into this rock in the year the course began, by the officer who made it, and he made it because a company was lost on Skellet, and the men who went up for them could not carry, and he built this whole place to make sure that never happened again. Every rule we have is downstream of that line. The ladder, the fords, the carry, the anvil, every hour of it exists to produce a man who will bring another man home. He turned round, and for 91 years we have stood on it and never looked down. Now, the rule of Gate 9 says a man does not leave his mark. Gentlemen, I have read the charter of this course 100 times, and the rule of Gate 9 has one purpose, which is to find the man who can be relied on. And last night on this stone, a man came off his mark for 9 minutes to keep a soldier of the Kastrell field army from going over that edge, and then walked back and stood on a chalk line that he had every reason to believe was worthless, for 83 more minutes in the dark, for nothing. You want to know whether he passed Gate 9? Osk's voice did not rise. It never did. Gentlemen, he is the only man in 91 years who has understood it. The results of the reckoning were posted in the drying room at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and they were on the wire to the capital by 6, and in every mess in Kastrell by the following night, and they are the reason you have heard of that year at all. 5 passed, the smallest intake in 3 decades. Reuel Vashek's name was at the top of it, where he had always intended it to be, and he told me years later that he has never once been able to look at that list with any pleasure, and that this is the best thing that ever happened to him. And under the 5 in the commandant's own hand was a 6th line. Ash C. Sergeant. The Household Guard of Harrowgate, Kingdom of Eldermore, attended as a guest of this army. Passed. Time on the anvil, 10 HRS 8 min, less 9 min off his mark, for which the directing staff record no penalty and offer no apology. Ledger note. The standing record of this course, held since its founding at 7 HRS 51 min, is superseded. The papers in the capital did what papers do. They had been promised an ornament and been given a soldier, and the phrase that stuck, a headline, I am sorry to say, and accurate, I am sorrier to say, was the mantelpiece HOLDS. He was offered the gray cord of the gray pikes at the passing out parade. He accepted it and thanked the colonel, and then asked whether he might not wear it, because the household guard wears no foreign device upon the king's coat, and he asked instead that it be sent to the guard room of the 2nd Company at Harrowgate and hung on the wall where the men change, so that the young ones would see it every morning and ask what it was. It hangs there, I have seen it. He asked for one other thing, and Colonel Osk granted it before he had finished the sentence. That candidate 90, Jory Ilk, who had stood 8.5 hours on the anvil and had gone down not from want of courage but from want of body weight, be permitted a second attempt. Ilk took it the following year. He passed at 6 hours and 10 minutes in a snowstorm, and he wears the cord, and he named his first son Corwin, which the man himself has never been told and which I have decided, on the whole, not to tell him. He went home on the 17th. They put the whole of Velhold out on the road down the hill, the DS, the staff, the cooks, the failed candidates who had not yet been sent away, 140 men in the freezing mud, and nobody had ordered it and nobody had organized it. He walked down through them with his kit bag on one shoulder and his cap square and his chin level, and he did not look left or right, because looking left or right is not something a household guardsman does, and at the bottom of the hill he stopped and turned and came to attention, and saluted the mountain, and got into the car. I am told that when he reached Harrowgate, King Alaric received him privately, and that the crown prince was there a good deal quieter by all accounts than he had been at the banquet, and Princess Adela, who had chosen him, and who said, when the account had been given, "Well, I did tell you it was a post." I am told the king asked him only one question. He asked what the foreign army had wanted to know. And Sergeant Corwin Ash said, "They wanted to know what we are for, sire. I could not tell them at the start, and I am not certain I can tell them now. But I think we are for standing where we are put, whether or not it is worth anything. It turns out that is a great deal harder than climbing a mountain, and a great deal more use than either of us thought." Then he asked to be excused, because his company had the 4 o'clock mount, and he did not wish to be late for it. And he went out and put on the red coat and the bearskin and the white gloves, and he walked out to a gate that nobody has ever tried to walk through, and he stood there. 11 years. I went to Harrowgate 3 summers ago. I am a colonel now, and I was there on the ministry's business, and I had an afternoon, and I did not tell anybody where I was going. The forecourt was full. It always is. There were tourists 3 deep at the railings with their phones up, and a family eating out of paper bags, and a man doing an impression of the guard's stance for his friends, and everybody laughing, and the guard at the near box standing in the sun in his red wool and his bearskin with the sweat running down under the chinstrap, looking at nothing. I did not recognize him at first. They are made not to be recognized. That is rather the point. Then I saw the way he was standing, the shoulders down and back and the whole man set, everything switched off that did not need to be on, burning nothing, waiting. And I knew him at 800 yards the way I had known him through a field glass on the ladder. I stood at the railings for a long time. I did not go and speak to him. He would not have been permitted to answer, and I would not have insulted him by making him try. What I did instead, in front of about 200 people who had no idea what they were looking at, was to come to attention on the cobbles in a foreign country in a civilian coat, and salute a man in a red tunic, whom every one of them believed to be a decoration. He did not move. Of course he did not move. He is not there to move. He is there so that the thing behind him stays standing, and it does, and nobody thanks him for it, and nobody ever will, and he will go on doing it until he is too old, and then another one will do it, and the whole arrangement is held up by nothing on earth except the fact that certain men do not leave their marks. I have the card still. I could burn it. I have thought about it. But I have a squadron of young officers now, and every year in the first week, I put it on the table in front of them and let them read it, and then I tell them about a rock called the Anvil, and a line cut into it 200 years ago that nobody bothered to look at, and a man who stood on a chalk mark for 83 minutes for nothing at all. And then I tell them the only thing I know for certain, which took me 31 years and 1 cold night to learn. You do not get to decide what a man is by looking at his coat. You have to make him stand in the weather, and then you have to be brave enough to be wrong.